a conversation about how we're trying to publicize the book, and hopefully asking you for some advice about that as well. So my curiosity in animal research was, it kind of began in the late 1990s when I was working at St Thomas's Hospital Medical School. I was doing some stroke research as a postdoctoral researcher. My background's in social sciences, sociology of medicine. And my office there was actually quite close to the animal labs. It took me a while to cotton on because the doors were always very locked and there were no sort of identifying notices on the doors. But then I very rarely saw animals being brought in or out of these labs through these underground service tunnels that actually ran beneath the medical school and popped up every now and again in various places. 2 years after I'd been there, the site was abandoned. We moved to another site, but after it was abandoned, some urban explorers went in and photographed the lab, and I was sort of finally able to see what had been behind those closed doors. And what I really became interested in was about the extent to which animal research benefits humans. And I was also curious because it was then a very taboo subject to talk about within a medical school. So it did arouse my curiosity. And at the time, when I went to look for information about whether animal research does benefit humans, I came across some very general statements, such as this one from the House of Lords: animal experimentation is a valuable research method which has proved itself over time. Or this one from the Royal Society: virtually every medical achievement of the last century has depended directly or indirectly on research with animals. And when I actually went to look for the evidence that was supporting these statements, I found very little, simply sort of isolated examples presented. So I began to sort of look into it more thoroughly, and the result was, a few years later, a paper that I published in the British Medical Journal with some colleagues, professors of epidemiology. And we really were just saying that, there doesn't seem to be much robust systematic evidence that animal research does benefit humans. And we advocated the use of systematic review methodology to try and investigate this. And then over subsequent years, animal research did come under a lot of scrutiny with systematic reviews, and there was a lot of investigation into the way these studies were done and whether they translated, whether animal research was helping to ensure the safety of medicines. So a lot of scrutiny about how predictive and productive it is. And after a few years, it was possible to draw some conclusions. And mainly these were that animal studies are not conducted according to accepted scientific standards. And for that reason, much of this research is unusable and wasted. And there were grave doubts about clinical translation. So I was shocked about this, because I thought that in a morally contested field such as animal research, surely scientists would take care to do their research to the highest possible standards in order to make each animal's life count and produce useful findings. And I wanted to make this latest evidence available, evidence about the limitations of animal research and the lack of translation. I began thinking about writing a book, and I wanted to focus on the science rather than the ethics of animal research, and the impact of animal research on humans rather than animals. I wanted it to be an affordable, accessible book because I wanted it to reach the general public, to take this evidence out of the pages of scientific journals and into the hands of ordinary people. And the aim was to change minds and hasten a transition to human biology-based approaches. So the book is in 4 parts. It begins with some historical investigation of the origins of animal research, and then I go on to look at the scientific limitations. In the 3rd part, I talk about human biology-based approaches, and finally look at the obstacles to change. And in writing the book, I drew upon scientific evidence, so the best I could find, but also interviews with experts and some personal experience, because I wanted to make it engaging and accessible. So now I'm just going to give you a quick whiz through the book. And as I say, it began with 2 historical chapters. And here I talk about the rise of the experimental method in the 19th century, and particularly in France. There was a lot of enthusiasm about the experimental method because it was associated with, proper hard science like physics and chemistry. And physiologists at the time were very interested in this, and particularly Claude Bernard, who was an early exponent of the experimental method. He was a physiologist and a doctor. And in 1865, he wrote this book, An Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine, in which he argued that studying animals under controlled laboratory conditions and then extrapolating the findings to humans was a more scientific approach than simply and directly observing patients at their bedside, as had formerly been the case. He wanted to place physiology on a firm scientific footing to make it into more respectable science, hard science, so-called. And Bernard believed that biomedical science should be conducted in the lab rather than at the patient's bedside. He actually rejected evolutionary theory, which was emerging at around the same time. And he believed that all animals shared what he called the same vital units, that he felt they were just arranged in different ways. And he also believed that species differences are quantitative rather than qualitative. And so he saw them as being differences of degree only, which could be scaled up using certain techniques, which could be accommodated using scaling techniques. And academic animal research is still to some extent under Bernard's influence in many of these respects. So animal experiments functioned to create distance from the patient's bedside. They made biomedicine seem more scientific. And they came to be seen as a robust scientific approach, partly through the use of statistics, the ability to control variables and so on, because they were done in a lab. And there was a consequent reluctance to criticize the practice. But in the book, I ask who benefited from them. I mean, certainly towards the end of his life, Claude Bernard himself was hard pushed when asked to give examples of how the experimental method had actually benefited humans and human medicine. But historians certainly agree that it was very successful at raising the status of physiology and medicine as professions. So I then go on to look at how animal research became sort of embedded and locked in over the 20th century. And here I look at the rise of sort of breeding programs, supplying laboratories with sort of specially bred standardized animals. The influence of the world wars, because that created a demand for animals with experiments on chemical warfare and radiation. Also the rise of the pharmaceutical industry and of national institutes of medical research, such as this one that used to be in Mill Hill, north of London, the 1968 Medicines Act. And all these came together so that we're now in a situation where animal research is embedded within many of our institutions, particularly educational and scientific institutions. And in the UK, in 1881, we went from a situation where there were 250 experiments. 1881 was the first time these statistics began to be recorded in the UK. And they rose in a few years to 95,000 and then peaked at 5.6 million in 1971. So they just became enormously successful in, the experimental method became enormously successful in terms of its popularity. So after those historical chapters, the main part of the book is then 5 chapters on the limitations of animal research methods and the outcomes. So here I look at individual studies. So I'm looking here at internal validity, the scientific quality of animal studies, but then also the extent to which they can be generalized to diverse human populations. And here I'm looking at problems with generalizing from animal models to human diseases, from homogeneous animal samples to diverse human populations, from the laboratory context to the clinical context, and of course, from animal species to human species. And I won't go through this in great detail because I know you're familiar with all this, but I cover and I argue that most animal research that's aimed at developing drugs for humans fails. I go through the poor rates of translation to humans, but also go into some detail in terms of how this creates huge unmet need for us in terms of even our most common diseases lacking effective and safe treatments, as well as the inability of animal studies to ensure the safety of human medicines, which makes us into the guinea pigs. And I also argue that, or I present evidence that suggests that any medical advances that are associated with animal use tend to be random, or they are random rather than consistent and reliable. Some of these studies here have shown this. And I argue that this is because species differences makes translation to humans a very hit and miss affair. So I go on then to look at, in 3 chapters, human biology-based approaches. And again, I won't linger on this because you all know much more than I do really about this, but I look at in vitro approaches, so organoids, organs on chips, in silico and AI, but also early detection approaches. So for example, the NHS is currently piloting a blood test for about 50 different cancers in thousands of people who have no symptoms in order to try and detect hidden cancers at their very earliest stages. This is the Galleri test, which was actually developed on the basis of Professor Azra Raza's human biology-based work, as she outlines in this book, The First Cell. And I argue that because, we've got these wonderful new methodologies and approaches together with the more familiar ones, such as epidemiology, prevention, clinical research, and so on, these are all ways in which we can directly study humans non-invasively, and so they're going to have, direct relevance to us. And then I ask, why on earth would we then want to study animals and then extrapolate the findings to humans? So, why are we still using animals? That's what I focus on in the final 3 chapters. Here I look at a range of different issues, such as the regulation of animals research, and the way in which animal studies continue to be approved despite their use really only supposed to be used as a last resort. The regulation of pharmaceutical products, the focus on refinement in the 3 Rs, the big project really to improve animal research rather than replacing it, the continued use of animal studies as the gold standard, and as I've already mentioned, the huge use of animals within our universities, medical schools, and the difficulty with actually sort of breaking free of that. It's very difficult to change the culture, the academic culture. That's a really big obstacle. The fact that animal research is, there's a lot of vested interest. People are making a lot of money from it, from suppliers of animals to people supplying equipment and food, cages, surgical equipment, and so on. And then the lack of funding for human biology-based approaches, together with the efforts of some organisations who exist to resist a transition away from animal research. But I also look at some good news, and many of the good and optimistic signs that are now beginning to emerge, such as the FDA Modernisation Act, which again, I'm sure you all know about. So that was a quick tour through the book. So when I finished writing it, we found an agent, a literary agent, who was very, on board with the project and very optimistic. And he sent the proposal to 30 publishing houses. And if you look here, these are quite big names, trade publishers. So he was optimistic, and the editors in these publishing houses were also really positive about the project. and the ideas, and they were really engaging with the argument. I'll show you some of the comments here. So right to take a scalpel for this unexamined idea, fully convinced of the argument, made me look afresh at animal testing, an eye-opening read. I won't read them all out, but generally they were very positive, caused me to rethink a lot of what I knew. But none of them felt that it was a marketable book. They didn't feel that they would be able to make money out of it because they didn't think there would be a large enough readership for the book. So, and they all really spoke with one voice on this. Wasn't sure the readers would go out and buy a book on the topic in large numbers. Not totally sure who the audience is. Important topic, couldn't quite picture the reader for it. The subject matter is a tough sell. And I did make it very clear that I wasn't going into any gory details about animal testing, that it was purely about the science. But nevertheless, they were still saying the details on animal testing are going to be too difficult to stomach to commit to a whole book. So, hit a bit of a problem there. So, I guess it's not surprising that editors thought the topic was a tough sell. It's not the most popular thing to think about. Social scientists have certainly looked at this, and they have pointed out, we fear that learning about animal research will have a negative impact. It's uncomfortable knowledge, as Steve Rayner has put it. We deal with it by switching off. It's something you just don't want to know. And some people will take active measures to avoid finding out about animal research, partly because it's unclear what they would be able to do with the knowledge once they gained it. And there is also a perception that there's no need to think about it because other people are dealing with it, and there's a perception that it's well regulated. So, a tough sell. So rather than abandoning the book, we decided to self-publish it, and we went with Matador, which was an arm of Troubadour Publishing. And very naively, I thought that, once you'd written a book and published it, then it would just end up in a bookshop and be out on one of these lovely tables and people would see it and buy it. But I've since learned that 100 to 1,000 titles compete for every available bookshop shelf space. Very competitive, and in fact a book has less than a 1% chance of being stocked in any particular bookshop. But added to that, the number of books published each year has completely exploded. So in the US alone, approximately 3 million new titles are published every year now, compared with 282,000 in 2005. So tricky. So this is one of the best-selling books ever. This is The Hobbit. It sold 100 million copies. But unfortunately, most books sell on average only 3,000 copies in their lifetime, with only 250 sales in the first year. These are all things I've only learnt since, and perhaps if I had known, wouldn't have started this project. The non-fiction sells even less, apparently, and the average self-published title will only sell around 250 copies during its lifetime. In fact, most sell less than 100 over their lifetime. So, to date, we have sold about very nearly 600 copies, which, for a self-published non-fiction unpopular topic, I guess is good, but we would really like to sell more. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've done to try and publicise Rat Trap. We took an active role from the start, so we launched online at the end of July with an online webinar which had 560 people registered, and this was a month ahead of the publication on August the 28th. We printed 20,000 leaflets, and we were really urging our supporters to buy and share the book, ask their bookshops and libraries to stock it. That's on the leaflets. We sent the ebook to scientists, celebrities, campaigners, journalists, patient safety advocates, using complementary Google and Apple codes that the publishers had supplied us with. And we also sent free print copies to around 100 key individuals that we'd identified. We offered ebooks to every biology teacher in the UK. And we also invited local and independent bookshops to stock Rat Trap, which happily several did agree to. This is a bookshop in Bath. And this is Bruna, a bookshop in the Netherlands, which also stocks it. We sent books and a poster about Rat Trap to the World Congress in Canada. And thanks to Kat Herman and Lindsay Marshall, we sold 2 boxes of books there. I gave a talk about it to the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics Summer School in August. And since then, I've also done interviews for BBC Local Radio, Talk Radio Europe, German Public Radio, and given interviews for Psychology Today, Antidote Europe, the Red Brick Science and Technology newsletter, which is a student publication at the Birmingham University, which I was quite pleased about because we really do want to target students. Just done a live Zoom interview and Q&A with the organisation called What Doctors Don't Tell You, who also published an abridged extract of the book in their magazine. We were mentioned in a Daily Telegraph article, and we've also started doing blogs. So we've just done a blog for Patient Safety Learning charity. We sold books at the Animal Free Research UK conference in October. This is me with Carla Owen. And we've also done podcasts. We did one with Carla Owen from Animal Free Research UK, and also with Emil Guillermo from PETA. I've done an interview with Dr. Pam Osanovsky from NAVS, and we had copies distributed to all the participants of the 9th Dutch Helpathon recently. Our supporters have bought copies to send to MPs, and a scientist recently ordered copies to send to 8 Dutch MPs too, which was good. One of our supporters so sweetly donated her winter fuel payment so that we could send free copies to libraries. That was really lovely. And we're still doing this. So we've got articles, blogs coming out actually in more pharmaceutical publications like the Medicine Maker, Drug Discovery World, International Pharmaceutical Industry magazine. Doing a podcast for Pharma Forum this week, and a webinar for the Humanimal Trust in December, which again is a slightly different audience for us. We've had some fantastic reviews, which I'm so pleased about because they, I don't know, I suppose after all the difficulties with publishing it, it was really nice to see that people were positive about the book, both from a scientific point of view and also that it was accessible and readable for non-scientific readers. But one of my favourite reviews that I found just recently was on Amazon. And this review is just very short. It says, "This book gives reasons why animal research in human medicine is not that useful. I can't be sure she's right, but it gives me a starting point to try to understand this issue. She uses data and has good arguments." But the reason I like this review is because this is the sort of person I had in mind when I was writing the book. You know, just an ordinary person who is willing to look at this and have their mind changed, I guess. But we do need to reach many more such people. And we also need to reach students, young people and policymakers, more MPs and peers. And we do plan to sort of try and get onto that in the new year. We're submitting an entry for the 2024 Lush Prize Public Awareness Award, which would be fantastic if we got that, because we have spent a lot of money on this, but it would also be great, you know, in terms of additional publicity. We're sending out a Christmas appeal to our supporters, but really I'm going to turn things over to you now, because we need some advice and inspiration on how else we can publicize the book and get it out into, you know, the general public. And also just to say, you know, if you plan to attend any events with members of the public, students, policymakers and so on, you know, please do consider asking us for copies. We might be able to give you discounted or even free copies. This isn't a money-making enterprise for us. This is really, you know, we're really just trying to change people's minds and hasten a transition to human biology-based approaches. So with that, I would just like to thank Kathy Archibald, who's been my constant companion and support throughout writing this book, but all the supporters of Safer Medicines Trust as well, and everyone who's helped us spread the word about Rat Trap, you know, here in the UK and all over the world. So thank you very much. And now, if any of you want to offer us some advice, that would be fantastic, or yeah, give any feedback or ask questions. So Natalie, oh, hang on. Have you started any outreach in Australia, or can we assist with that here in Oz? Most definitely. We haven't done any outreach in Australia. Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, we would love your help. We would really love your help. And that little review that I read out, I think was from someone in Australia. So it is out there, and I think people abroad can get the book from Amazon, because it's on abroad it's on a print on demand basis, so it should be easy to get hold of. But yeah, we can definitely talk about that. Thank you. Any other comments or advice or inspiration?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm trying to the only thing I can do at the moment is to try and get the our local college to take it. They don't have courses for sort of really high flying people, but they do have sort of things like veterinary medicine courses and some courses relating to biology, medicine, and so on. I'm sort of still trying to sort out how I'm going to sort of sell it to them, because I noticed that I agree with some of the comments from some of the editors that you were dealing with trying to get them to publish the book.
Yeah.
It is a hard sell. One of the things that there seems to be a wide perception that using animals is a mandatory requirement in the UK. Now, I'm still trying to get my head around this. I believe it is a mandatory requirement in some countries, the US, I believe, but in the UK, I've looked at the relevant legislation, ASPA, and although REACH doesn't apply directly to this, I've been looking at REACH regulations as well, and I cannot see anything in there that specifically says that animals must be used. In fact, it starts off by saying that animals shouldn't be used unless absolutely necessary. But there's still this wide perception amongst the public, and indeed in science. So that's still a difficult one to get round.
First of all, it's no longer mandated in the US, because the FDA Modernization Act has now made it possible for scientists to develop medicines using what they consider to be the best, most scientific approach. So it hasn't banned the use of animals, but it means other approaches can be used. So that's one thing. In the UK, there was an interesting clarification recently, because an MP asked specifically that question in our UK Parliament, whether it was mandatory, and the answer was no, that it wasn't mandatory. And there has been a lot of confusion about this, because there is a perception that obviously the regulators do ask for animal tests, but it's been a confusing picture. But in fact, it appears that there is no legal requirement for animals to be used for the safety testing of medicines. So that's important. But I mean, if you are trying to get the book trying to sort of sell the book to your local college, I guess it's worth emphasising how these changes are, you know, these optimistic changes are happening and people are beginning to change their minds. And also emphasize that the book doesn't have any, you know, nasty details about animal experiments. You know, it's purely about the scientific arguments and the obstacles and the new approaches, I guess. If that's any help. But it would be fantastic if you are able to try and get it into your college. If there's lots of young people there, that's exactly who we're trying to reach, you know.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you very much, Cliff. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Thank you, Natalie. So we can be in touch about that. Okay. Well, I can hang on a little bit longer just in case people have any. I mean, are there any people there who are going to be attending any events in the near future, and we could help by providing books? Cliff, obviously, if you would like to get in touch with us about that, you're very welcome.
Yeah. Okay.
Davina.
Congratulations for your book.
Thank you.
So what I was thinking is that, you know, major, I mean, diseases that affect a large number of people, like respiratory diseases and cardiorespiratory diseases, there is a bulk number of scientists trying to answer questions on these diseases, and they have their societies. So especially the respiratory societies and the cardiovascular societies, they have large number of members, maybe to try, and they use animal models, maybe to present, to have a stand when they have a conference.
Okay.
And they have a British, there is the British Thoracic Society. This actually, I think starts Wednesday, British Thoracic Society this week in London. They have maybe it's too, we don't have a lot of time, but you can try to reach first maybe the British societies, and try to have a stand, because I do think they, I know that they have stands, you know, with books and with to have a stand or a small table, something that you could expose the books and try to reach for these researchers using animal models.
Yeah, no, that's a really good idea to go to conferences and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Davina.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you. Okay, getting some good ideas. Anything else? Okay, well, I think if that's it, we could probably wrap up there. Richard, I don't know if you're there. Do you agree?
The window cleaner man's here.
Okay.
Can you help me?
Yeah.
Unlock the gates now.
Yeah.
Richard, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Pandora. Thank you for that. That's great. I think it's a nice to stop. Thank you for everyone for joining. The meeting has been recorded and it will be made available on the Alliance Exchange website. So feel free to watch it back if you wish. But yeah, no, and thanks again, Pandora. Really appreciate your time. It's a brilliant book. So yeah,
Thank you to everyone. Thanks very much. And thanks for asking me, Richard.
you. Anytime. Cheers, Pandora.
Bye-bye then.
Bye.